Hey guys, Zach here, and today I want to go over 5 tips for beginners that I wish I knew when I was a beginner. Before I get into it, if you guys would consider subscribing down below, it does help out the channel, and with that out of the way, let's get into it. Tip number 1 is going to make sure your tank is not too small. Now, I know it's tempting when you go to the store and you see these nice small little cube aquariums or these really small ones, to get those, save a little bit of space, save a little bit of money on everything, and go with a nice small tank. However, this can be detrimental to you, and smaller tanks are sometimes harder to maintain than bigger tanks. I wouldn't recommend for beginners a tank that is under 10 gallons. I would start with about 10 gallons, and this is for a couple different reasons. The first reason I would not go under 10 gallons is just going to be for the balancing purposes of the tank. When you get smaller tanks, they can be very chemically unstable, and it tends to lead to a lot of issues. An example of this is just if you have something on your hand and you put your hand into the aquarium to do anything, in a 5-gallon tank, that little amount of stuff on your hand is going to have a much bigger impact than in something like a 10-gallon. Remember, you're doubling the volume of water that you're working with if you go from a 5-gallon to a 10-gallon, and it just creates a little bit more stability in the system. The second reason I wouldn't recommend going under 10 gallons is just for the fish's sake. You can't keep very many fish in a small 5-gallon tank. 10-gallon really is pretty close to the minimum that I would recommend for most fish. And even if you do understock it, you can fill it up with plants and it'll look just as good. On the flip side, I also wouldn't recommend to any beginners out there to go with a tank that is too big. These larger tanks can just require more maintenance, and you can also have troubles with lighting if they're super tall or super deep, and you can have a whole bunch of other issues start to come up if you go too large. For that reason, I say a 10-gallon minimum, and I would say maximum of about 20 gallons if you're starting out. My first tank was a 20-gallon, and I found a lot of success with that. So for that reason, the first tip is to make sure your tank isn't too small, and also not too big. Tip number 2 is going to be keep it simple. And that's in regards to your scape and your substrate setup. I have found that it gets very easy to overcomplicate scapes and start working in all these intricate details or doing these builds that are super tedious and take a long time, take a lot of patience, and take a lot of extra materials. But if you're starting out, just keep the scape super simple. My first tank, I basically had a rock and a chunk of wood. I threw it in there and I liked how it looked, and I was super happy with that. And keeping it simple kept it really easy for me, and it was much more about experimenting with the plants and keeping the fish than really focusing hard on the hardscape. In regards with keeping it simple, you can also keep the substrate simple as well. My first tank, it was just aqua soil in the bottom. I know you might want to do like 3 or 4 different substrates and mix a couple different sands, but just keeping it simple will really keep your maintenance down, and it's also going to save you a little bit of money, right? If you're just buying a bag of aqua soil instead of buying aqua soil, sand, maybe some gravel, right, that can start to add up. But if you are starting out, I would recommend to try and keep it super simple. With that being said, I'm not going to stop you if you do want to put down aqua soil and then put sand on top of it just to cap it off, right? If you're going for a sandy bottom, that's perfectly fine because it's important to keep the nutrients in the sand. However, in regards to keeping it simple, the reason I say this is because if you're starting out, you probably only have one tank, and chances are after maybe 6 months, 8 months, a year, whatever it is, you're going to want to rescape the tank, and I've found that keeping it simple helps later down the line as well. My first tank, since I only had aqua soil in the bottom and I had a sparing hardscape of just like a rock and a chunk of wood, I was very, very happy when I was going to rescape it that it was kept so simple because it was easy, right? I just removed the plants that were in there, took out the hardscape, and I could leave the substrate because it was just aqua soil. And I was like, oh, I want to add some sand, so I could cap it off with sand and not really mess up too much in regards to the substrate. So for that reason, tip number 2 is going to be keeping it simple. My third tip to all the beginners out there is to try out a bunch of different plants. By try out a bunch of different plants, I mean it in two ways. The first way that I mean to try out plants is to try a wide variety of plants and try plants that work in all the different spots. You want to try out foreground plants, you want to try out epiphytes, you want to try out crypts, you want to try out swords, you want to try out stems, maybe some mosses, maybe a couple floating plants. You want to try out a whole bunch of different plants just to see what you like, maybe what works in your tank, what you kind of find less appealing. So maybe you like certain ones and don't like certain ones, but you wouldn't know unless you really experimented and tried it out. So it's important to try out that wide variety of plants just to see what you like and to see what you're going to use moving forward in maybe future tanks. Now the second reason why I say you should try out a bunch of different plants is to see what plants work in your water. Everybody's water is going to be slightly different. The pH, the KH, the GH, and even every tank is going to be a little bit different. So it's important to try out a bunch of plants to see what works in your water. What works for me in my water and what plants really like my water might not like your water, right? They could even be the exact same pH, and sometimes it's just finicky like that, and plants like certain tanks and don't like other tanks. I know personally I've tried out a bunch of plants and in one tank, super successful. Other tanks, they just wither and die right away. So it's important to try it out and see what works in your tanks. One thing to consider when you are trying out a bunch of different plants is just going to be the difficulty level that the manufacturers do put on the plants. So some companies will put their ratings, like Tropica does. They'll have like easy, medium, hard, really hard, or whatever it might be. And when you're trying out plants, don't let this stop you. If you really like the look of a plant and maybe it's a hard or maybe it's a medium and you're just starting out and you're not too sure, you want to start out with beginners, then by all means, start out with mostly beginners. But if you really like the one plant, get it. You never know, it could work out in your tank. Maybe it's just one that requires a little bit more light, or maybe it requires a little bit more CO2. So in your tank, it might grow a little slower, but if you really like the plant, chances are you're going to want to take care of it, and that plant is going to grow, and you're going to be much happier with that plant that you like the look of than going with an alternative that's like an easy that you kind of feel iffy about, right? So try out a bunch of different plants and don't let the levels of difficulty stop you. My fourth tip to beginners out there is to schedule your maintenance. I have found that this helps me tremendously, and if I schedule maintenance, I know pretty much when I need to do something or if I need to do something, and I can work from that schedule to build time for the aquariums. The first reason why I recommend scheduling your maintenance is just to build that consistency and that habit of working on the aquarium. Now, you might only have like an hour a week that you want to dedicate to working on the aquarium, and that's perfectly fine, but if you can do it consistently, maybe the same day every week, then you're going to get into a habit of, okay, it's whatever, let's say Wednesday night, and it's time to work on the aquarium, and you're going to not neglect the aquarium, and the aquarium's not going to get out of hand. And this is good because this scheduling helps keep the balance of the aquarium and lets it prosper. Now the second reason is because of something that I did when I first started out, and it's what I would call over maintenance. And that's when you don't schedule your maintenance, so you end up doing little bits every single day, and I would warn very much against this. The first reason is that it can damage the overall health of your tank. I know for me, I was taking trimmings from plants way too often, and it just wasn't letting them grow at all. And after a couple months, I was like, man, why aren't my plants growing? And then I thought, and I was like, well, I've been cutting them way too much, and that really set me back a little bit. Now, the second reason is that if you're constantly in your tank, like every day for a little bit, it can scare some of the inhabitants, and it can make the fish very skitterish, and that'll take away from the overall tank if you constantly have fish that are always hiding whenever you walk in the room. My fifth tip to all you beginners out there is going to be add slowly. And by this, I mean at the point that your aquarium has cycled and you're ready to go to the store and get the inhabitants, be it fish, be it shrimp, be it whatever it might be, add them in slowly and block it out. And I'll explain this because there are a couple of reasons why it's super important. By adding slowly, I mean if you're planning to have your tank, you want to have some shrimp in there, you want to have a school of fish and maybe a centerpiece fish, then maybe you go and get the shrimp, put them in your tank, wait like a week or two, and then go and get your schooling fish, put them in, wait like a week or two, and then add in your centerpiece fish. Now this does a lot of different things for your tank when you do it this way. First is that the beneficial bacteria in your tank is able to grow its colony size and adapt as you're adding more bio load. If you go and you get the schooling fish, the centerpiece fish, and the shrimp, maybe some snails, whatever it might be, and you add them all at once, you're increasing the biomass in your tank exponentially right away in one trip. And this can let algae and other things grow and allow waste to build up, and it can be very bad for your tank. The second reason I recommend adding in your inhabitants slowly is because it gives you time. Time's super important because maybe something goes wrong with your tank and you have to change some stuff or do a bunch of maintenance. It just gives you time in between adding inhabitants to not stress out the fish. So if you add your shrimp and then something goes wrong, well, good thing you don't have fish in there that you're going to stress out, because you can do your maintenance and probably get away without any fatalities in the shrimp. But maybe something goes wrong between getting your schooling fish and your bigger fish. Well, if they get like a sickness or something, you don't want to spread that to other fish and have more potential loss. And this time also allows you to do research. So say you get shrimp and you get fish and then you get more fish. Well, maybe you're getting Caridina shrimps or Neocardinas, you can research them. Once you add them, then you can focus your research more so on maybe a schooling fish like a tetra, and really research that tetra and understand what its habits might be, what it likes to eat, what the optimal temperature is for it, and really get to understand the fish. And then once you get them, the tank's already set out for them and ready for them, and then you can go back and maybe get like a centerpiece fish to go with the schooling tetras and do a bunch of research on that, and you've got that time, and it will really pay off in the long run. So that is everything for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have enjoyed the video or found these tips useful, please consider subscribing, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.